Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
In the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was plunged into civil war. Powerful generals and their private armies fought for control of the state until one man stood victorious, the absolute master of the Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
When we left Rome at the end of the 2nd century BC, it was triumphant in its growing wealth and power. But if you were an ordinary Roman, there was also a great deal to be worried about. The wars of expansion into Greece and Asia had dealt a terrible blow to small freehold farmers who were the mainstay of the Roman state. Those who went off to war returned to find their farms gone to pot, and they were the lucky ones. A lot of men never returned at all. Once back home, the survivors had trouble re-establishing their holdings. Cheap grain was now pouring in from the provinces, the same provinces, ironically, that the farmer soldiers had helped to conquer. With so much grain now available on the market, prices plummeted. Much of the farmer's land was better suited to other uses anyway, raising cattle or growing grapes or olives. And all of these could be worked cheaper on much larger spreads by slaves provided in great numbers and who furnished hard labor in return for bare subsistence. The family farmer could not compete. The rich who found the capital to buy up the small farms got richer, while the farmers got poorer, and a lot of them sold out to large landowners. They moved into the city to swell the number of proletarians, to live on the bounty of the state, and to be manipulated by the politicians. Cicero, the statesman and philosopher, was advised by his brother to flatter endlessly. This is wrong and shameful in ordinary life, but necessary in running for office. Let the voters say and think that you know them well, that you greet them by name, that you are generous and open-handed. If possible, accuse your competitors of having a bad reputation for crime, vice, or bribery. And so, by the late 2nd century BC, social unrest had become a serious problem. The displaced and needy masses were pressured by the rich, trying to squeeze as much as possible out of them, and this included the conservative Senate, which was indifferent to their plight. The poor of Rome had few political options. Constitutionally, authority lay in the Senate and the people, but practically the state was run by the Senate alone. And this august body, with its massive authority and responsibilities, was really a municipal council that had been propelled into governing half the known world. It was simply not equipped for the job. Most senators just wanted the world to stand still, but it wouldn't stand still, it never does. While the senators could handle foreign problems by simply throwing soldiers at them, social and economic problems were beyond them. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, the noble grandson of the man who defeated Hannibal, took up the cause of the poor. He tried to limit the size of large estates and to provide land for the landless. But he was murdered by a group of conservative senators and their followers, beaten to death with chairs. His brother, Caius Gracchus, tried to carry on his work, but he too was murdered. It appeared that the Senate, with its determination to keep the status quo, had triumphed. But in fact, the political landscape had been changed by the Gracchi brothers and their followers. For the first time in Roman history, a popular party had grown up to challenge the authority of the Senate. But this was not a blow for democracy, as some might expect. On the contrary, the situation was made to order for men like Julius Caesar, who knew how to use and manipulate class hatred and social unrest for their own careers. Caesar was one of several outstanding generals who were also politicians, men who married politics to the army in the 1st century before Christ. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, they would all become dictators in turn, either in the name of the people or of the Senate and so-called tradition. It didn't seem to matter which. The 1st century BC was a bloody time of plots and rivalries among men who were too powerful to be stopped themselves, yet not quite powerful enough to stop others from following in their footsteps. With their armies behind them, they would march into Rome in times of crisis and force the Senate to vote them extraordinary powers, ostensibly to bring order and stability to the state. Then they would eliminate their enemies as best they could, opening an era of political murder that was going to last for several centuries and that would fill the history books with the most fascinating gore. The generals also became very rich men. Here is Plutarch's description of Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a very successful commander who retired to private life in 63 before Christ. Lucullus's life presents us at the beginning with political acts and military commands, and at the end with drinking bouts and banquets and what were practically orgies, torch races, all manner of frivolity. For I count as frivolity his sumptuous buildings, porticos and baths, still more his paintings and statues. You see, he doesn't like the absence of gravitas. Once, when he dined alone, he became angry because only one modest course had been prepared and called the slave in charge. When the slave said that he didn't think there would be need of anything expensive since there were no guests, Lucullus said, "What? Do you not know that today Lucullus dines with Lucullus?" Well, Lucullus and his kind were men of great appetite, not only for luxury, not only for food, but also for power. And that power rested in their legions. Such might was made possible by the general Marius, who in 107 BC introduced an innovation that completely reshaped the army. and ultimately upset the balance of power in the Republic. He did this by throwing out the financial requirements for enlistment and accepting volunteers from the whole citizen body. The poor proletarians rushed in to be equipped and paid by the state, while the other classes, who were growing less enthusiastic about military service because they had better things to do at home, stayed out altogether. Army pay was not very good even for a proletarian. But a successful commander could be expected to provide his men with a share of the spoils or a parcel of land on discharge. And these rewards, which could substantially improve a man's life, were under the control of the general. It followed from this that the Roman legions were no longer loyal to the state, but to their commanders. Consider the Roman general Pompey, who lived from 106 to 48 BC. At the age of 28, Pompey was commissioned to raise an army to protect the Senate from other overly ambitious generals. He put down one major rebellion, but in the process his army became a private army, even to the point that his soldiers directed their oath of loyalty not to Rome, but to him personally. A general with such an army behind him could then dominate or intimidate the Senate into giving him other commands and honors. And from there, it was only a short step to using his power to brush aside the senators and legalize his hold on the state as well. This is what happened with Pompey and a number of others, until it became clear to every thinking Roman that the days of the Republic were numbered. It had become a government not of law, but of men, ambitious, powerful, ruthless men. The generals and their legions had proved so successful that Rome controlled an extraordinary amount of territory by the middle of the 1st century BC. But this expansion also brought with it new threats. In the east, there was the growing power of the Parthian Empire, which had taken the place of the Persians. In the north, there was the thundercloud of hostile Germanic peoples. In the south, there were Arab raids in Asia and Numidians in Africa, and even inside the Roman state, a lot of provinces were muttering volcanoes. The provincial governors appointed by Rome were changed each year, and their performance depended completely on their individual character. There was no permanent civil service to provide stability. Here we see provincial peasants paying their taxes. The revenues from the provinces were the chief source of income for Rome, and tax collection was invariably farmed out to joint stock companies of Roman capitalists who paid the state only a fraction of what they extorted from the native people. Something had to change, but what? The necessary reforms could not come from the Senate because it was too conservative and it was losing its grip anyway. And reforms were not likely to come from the radicals either, since they were mostly demagogues interested in power. So a lot of Romans began to think that the Republic would have to be replaced, probably by a single ruler. The question then arose of who that ruler was going to be, because in the chaotic conditions of the 1st century BC, several great men faced each other, each with his own army, each claiming to stand for Rome, each trying to keep it in his grasp. In the end, this struggle left Julius Caesar victorious. He took power in 46 BC, and at once the Senate rushed to load him with honors. The honor he liked best was the right to wear the triumphal laurel wreath at all times because this made his baldness less conspicuous. But there were more serious advantages. He was voted consul and the first dictator for life. The month of his birth was called by his name, July. And he was given the title of Imperator, which used to mean simply victorious general, but which came to mean what it now signifies, emperor, sovereign ruler. Caesar did not live long to enjoy his power. After only 2 years of dictatorship, he was murdered in the Senate in 44 BC by men who were not willing to see the Republic die so easily. But the Republic was doomed in spite of the senators' efforts. There was another period of anarchy and bloody struggle before Julius Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, vanquished his uncle's enemies and his own. In 31 before Christ, at the Battle of Actium, he defeated his last serious rival, Mark Antony, who had allied himself with the last Ptolemy queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. And so, Octavian was now the absolute master of the empire. He inherited all of Caesar's powers, and he increased them further. Within 4 years of Actium, the Senate conferred upon him a combination of military and religious titles, Emperor Augustus, and so he too got a month of his own. The greatest monument to the long reign of Augustus was going to be the Pax Romana, the longest period of peace and stability the Mediterranean world has ever known.
Augustus's two main props were the imperial bureaucracy and the imperial army of defense, which were both under his authority. Although ostensibly he ruled with the Senate, he saw to it that the Senate was colonized by his men and that the imperial civil service, which was nominally under Senate scrutiny, was filled with his choices too. In fact, he dominated everything.
These civil servants would prove indispensable to the sprawling empire, and the growing number of administrators reflected a new degree of social mobility and opportunity because these people were being recruited from the general body of citizens, not just the patricians. Sometimes they might even be ex-slaves or freedmen. At the same time, Augustus tried to reawaken Rome's citizens to their civic duties in order to keep them loyal to the state. He tried very hard to revive the old Roman virtues, using Roman history and legends very much as American history was once used to discourage small children from telling lies or to encourage adults to patriotism and enterprise. All this, however, depended on the army, or rather on the fundamental stability and security that only the army could provide. Under Augustus, and for some time thereafter, every army commander depended directly on the emperor, not on the Senate or the people. He was no longer an entrepreneur recruiting soldiers and gambling on his own abilities. He was an employee of the state who could be transferred from one army to another, just as generals are today. Except for the household troops of the emperor, the Praetorian Guard, shown here, the great bulk of the army was based along the frontiers, strung out in small garrisons and fortified camps along thousands of miles of imperial boundaries. Meanwhile, the old aggressiveness was disappearing, partly because everyone was heartily sick of fighting, and partly because, in the long run, war has to pay. And there were few enemies with wealth worth conquering around the border, and those who did border Rome were very tough indeed. From now on, the biggest threat would be the poor and hungry barbarians trying to get inside rich Roman territory. And so the army became a defensive force, increasingly expert in building border fortifications like this one on the Danube. It was not very interested in expansion anymore, because expansion would only cost money and strain the administration without bringing any tangible benefits. There was little treasure in the lands of the barbarians, only trouble. But the imperial army was more than just a thin wall strung out around the empire. Its permanent camps became centers of urban development, centers of Roman civilization. Many of the great cities of Europe were born as army camps, from Vienna and Budapest to York, from Lisbon and Bordeaux to Cologne.
The centuries of security that the Roman army ensured, and the roads it built, and the settlements it created, allowed Greco-Roman culture to take root so deeply that even when the barbarian invaders eventually broke through, they were not able to dispel it. A lot of our culture today is owed in no small part to those legions.
Each army outpost bore the signs of Roman life, from its temples and public buildings to its theaters and baths. We talked earlier about the impact of Greek philosophy and learning. Now, in the West, with a mark of Rome everywhere, education in Latin became an important vehicle for social mobility, especially for civil servants. And it was also a vehicle for socialization to teach the conservative values of the Roman ruling class. In architecture, the Romans developed the dome and large-scale vaulting, and the whole concept of vast, impressive interior space that had not much interested the Greeks. These were spectacular architectural advances. Still, to a layman like myself, the main contribution of the Romans was to take Greek designs and make them larger and grander. Roman architecture also made vast advances in engineering. Roman sculpture reflects Roman practicality. It brought a new realism to the Greek models, which Romans had been copying for centuries. You can see it especially in the portrait busts of the emperors, which were to be found in every corner of the empire.
Augustus and his Pax Romana preserved the Roman or Greco-Roman tradition. Without him, Rome would have lost her conquests one by one and seen them relapse into barbarism or degenerate into petty tyrannies. The barbarians of the east and the north would have invaded Roman territories centuries before they did. A parochial Rome would certainly have been destroyed by civil war. and the great institutions of Hellas would have been choked by debris instead of being carried forward by conscientious Roman students. And when Christianity came in during the 1st century AD, this imperial Roman tradition, which the reforms and the will of Augustus had made possible, would profoundly influence the organization and the thinking of the church. The imperial tradition would Romanize Christianity, would help make it the great organized, centralized, bureaucratized institution it eventually became, quite literally the Church of Rome, as we shall see next time.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.